Welcome back, everybody. It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. So I'm going to be going over 6 players that I've identified as players I sort of expect to be busts this season in 2024. Always fun to sort of look at these guys, sort of look at which guys I really just don't find myself drafting a whole lot of and see whether I generally agree with that, and just sort of what my overall expectations are for these guys. Not all of these guys are guys that I necessarily are saying are going to completely suck this season, but really what I'm getting at is that I don't think any of these guys have a real shot at necessarily beating their ADP. So I think you're all going to be disappointed if you draft any of these players. I tried to mix it up and get players at each position. So we've got 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, and a tight end here. So yeah, let me know if you guys disagree or agree with any of these players. If you guys have any additional comments or anything, always fun to interact with you guys there. It's a lot of fun, just sort of seeing what you guys think as well. It's got a lot more off season to go, but we're really starting to ramp up here with training camp and all that happening. We're 2 months away from the heat of draft season and all that, so it's going to be a lot of fun and really fun making these videos and all that. So yeah, that being said, let's just sort of get into the first player here. So starting things off with potentially a bit of a controversial one, I'm here to say that Patrick Mahomes is going to be a bust this season. This isn't obviously me saying that Patrick Mahomes is going to be bad. He's obviously the most talented quarterback in the NFL, and he's clearly a player that's going to have some week-winning performances over the course of the year. But I think what we saw last season with Mahomes finishing as the quarterback 8 on the season is a lot closer to what we're going to see this year than what his ADP is. He's currently being drafted as the quarterback 3, going in the 3rd or maybe early 4th round right now, and I don't think there's any real reason to be more optimistic about his outlook this year than what we saw last season. The pass catching options are largely unchanged. I know they drafted Xavier Worthy in the 1st round. I'm not personally a believer in Xavier Worthy. He's just a fast player. He wasn't really able to get open in college. I think he's just going to be maybe a little bit better than what like MVS was for them last season. Obviously, they brought over Marquise Brown as well in free agency. He hasn't been good for several years. He was nothing for the Cardinals last year. I mean, on top of that, Travis Kelce, he's a year older. He's just obviously a player that's declining. Obviously, Kelce's still great, but we can't expect him to keep putting up the same quality of numbers. We're going to see some regression over the next several years out of Travis Kelce for as long as he continues to play. And on top of that, Rashee Rice involved in several off-the-field incidents over the course of this offseason. He's likely to see a suspension at some point, and Rice was honestly their best pass catcher over the back half of last season. That's going to be a big hit for this offense. And on top of that, the defense in Kansas City is legitimately great. I think you could argue that this is one of, if not the best defense in the NFL at this point in the season, at this point in the offseason. And they also have a really effective run game with Isaiah Pacheco. Their strategy to win games doesn't necessarily need to be Patrick Mahomes going out there and throwing for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns every single week. They don't need him to put up MVP numbers for them to win a lot of games, and it makes a lot of sense. They can save their offense for the playoffs, keep Kelce limited. Obviously, he's an older body. It makes sense for them to sort of unleash him when they get towards those must-win games, and they can lean on Isaiah Pacheco in this run game, and that's going to just be really trouble for you guys in fantasy because Mahomes isn't going to necessarily need to put up those 300-yard, 3-touchdown games over the course of the season, and with him not necessarily being a mobile quarterback, I know he adds 300 to 400 rushing yards on the ground every single season, but he's not a guy like Lamar or Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts that's going to put up a very significant amount of points in that regard. You're going to need high passing volume, high passing production for him to be a good fantasy asset, and I just don't necessarily see him being like that this season. There's also just a lot of quarterbacks going after him that I really love, and guys that I think are really similar. You could think like C.J. Stroud, Dak Prescott, Jordan Love, Kyler Murray, Joe Burrow, a lot of quarterbacks that are going significantly later than him that certainly have the same upside as him. And you could even look at Anthony Richardson, who's a guy that could potentially even lap the field with all his rushing ability. Obviously, Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen. I think there's a very real chance that Patrick Mahomes finishes closer to the quarterback 10 this season than the quarterback 3. And I think if that happens, obviously he's going to be a bust for you guys. So I just don't recommend drafting him this year. Still a great player. I'm not crapping on Mahomes as a player at all, but I think for fantasy, it just doesn't really add up this season. Next up, we've got our first running back on the list, and I'm going to start things off with Ramondre Stevenson, who just simply didn't look good to me even when he was healthy last season. Obviously, we know he missed a lot of time last season. That's when Zeke sort of took over and had a bit of a really large role in this offense. He finishes the running back 35 last season, 28th in points per game, so it's not like the injuries really knocked him down too far on the season-long totals, and he's currently being drafted as the running back 20 right now, and I think you could legitimately argue that he's got more competition for touches around him. You've got Antonio Gibson, who was brought in at the immediate start of free agency here this offseason. Obviously, I know Antonio Gibson's not necessarily special, but he's definitely a much better player than what Ezekiel Elliott is at this point in their careers. And on top of that, you've got a new coaching staff in New England. There's no necessarily loyalty to Ramondre Stevenson here. And Antonio Gibson's a much more explosive player. He's a better pass catcher than Ramondre Stevenson, so he's going to take that role away from Ramondre. And we've seen Antonio Gibson handle a large chunk of snaps before. So I think there's legitimately an opportunity here where this is just a 50-50 timeshare in an offense that we know could legitimately be the worst offense in the NFL here. They've got a rookie quarterback in Drake May. They don't really have any proven pass catchers on the offensive side of the ball. It's not going to be fun to watch the Patriots play offense this season, and you're drafting a guy at running back 20 who's probably splitting touches in a really bad offense. You're going to have limited scoring opportunities. Like I said, Antonio Gibson's probably going to get the lion's share of the passing down work, so you're going to have limited opportunities for pass catching, limited scoring opportunities, and Rhamondre Stevenson, who just wasn't a player that was very efficient last season, averaged only 4.4 yards per carry, a career low. Just didn't look like himself. If he's not efficient and he's not getting a ton of volume and there's no scoring opportunities, there's just no real world here where Rhamondre Stevenson puts up a big season. And on top of that, I think that he really just can't burn you. There's no world where you lose your league because you didn't draft Rhamondre Stevenson. The Patriots, they've got no shot at being a top 10 offense this season. Rhamondre would need Antonio Gibson to probably get hurt, so then he ends up seeing like a 90% snap share in this offense for him to actually end up being like a legitimate running back one this season. So a lot would need to break right for him to really burn you by not drafting him, and I think there's just the clear path is that he ends up outside the top 30 at the position. That's certainly what I'm expecting. I just don't see a world where he ends up being a legitimately valuable fantasy asset for you guys this season, and drafting him running back 20 that's pretty high end capital. It's just way too much for me right now. Next up, we've got our second and last running back we'll highlight on this list, and it's going to be Austin Ekeler. It's tough to say that a guy being drafted outside of the top 24 can really be a bust, but I don't see a world where Ekeler finishes even remotely close to the top 24 at the position. He's currently being drafted as the running back 26, and there's just nothing really that gets me excited here about Austin Ekeler. He's going to be playing behind Brian Robinson, who to me looked actually pretty good last season. He's a player that we know is going to get the short yardage work, was honestly pretty effective when given opportunities last season, and I don't see any world where Austin Ekeler can at least usurp him in the goal line category. Beyond that, Austin Ekeler just looked really bad last season. I know he was playing through some injuries and some nicks and bruises here, but in general, when you look at an older running back or an older player in general that puts up a bad season, it's just generally a bad idea to take a look at that and say they're going to bounce back the following season. There are obviously some outliers here and there, but in general, when a player starts regressing and they're along that age cliff line, what it really means is that they are just getting older and they're not as good as they once were. And really the only opportunity for Austin Ekeler here to put up high-end fantasy numbers would be that he just gets a ton of usage through the air, and that's just not something that's going to happen in this Commanders offense. They're going to be a run-first team in all likelihood. They've got a defensive-minded head coach in Dan Quinn, and Jaden Daniels is a rookie quarterback who I don't expect to throw the ball to the running back position very much at all this season. He's hyper-mobile. We see more and more that these hyper-mobile quarterbacks are not guys that look to dump the ball down, just because instead of dumping it down, they can take off and run the ball themselves. So you're going to see Ekeler, who historically has gotten most of his production from touchdown upside by being a part of a good offense and getting goal line work, and then being super involved in the passing game. And he's now going to be a part of a much worse offense, not have the goal line role, and he's not going to be throwing the ball as much as he has been in the past. So there's just nothing to really be excited about there. And then on top of that, I know it's really hard to look at schedules right now, but the end of the season for Austin Ekeler this season, he ends the season with Tennessee, a bye, New Orleans, Philadelphia, and Atlanta. All four of the teams he plays in that last 5-week stretch are teams that were ranked bottom 10 in terms of favorable matchups for running backs, meaning they gave up the least fantasy points to opposing running backs last season. So that's 4 straight really bad matchups in the fantasy playoffs. And right when you get into there, and you've got a bias in there, so there's just no real world that I see where Austin Ekeler ends up being the guy that helps you in the fantasy playoffs, even if he ends up being okay. And he's just not someone that I'm really excited about. So I think he's probably going to finish outside the top 30 at the position, probably outside the top 40 to be honest. And he's just someone that I'm not seeing myself draft any of this season. Next up, we've got the first wide receiver on this list, and that's going to be Michael Pittman Jr. And I think it's harsh to say this because I do think Pittman's a legitimately really talented player, and he's probably going to finish as like a low-end wide receiver 2. I currently have him statted out as my wide receiver 26, which I think is perfectly fine. It's not necessarily a bad player to have on your fantasy roster, but he's just being drafted way too high. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 12 off the board, and I just don't see any world where he puts up that high of a finish this season. He's coming off of a season last year where he finished as the wide receiver 13. That was the best season of his career, and that's still behind where he's being drafted right now. And a full season of Anthony Richardson likely means that we're going to see some decreased passing volume in this offense. This was a team last year that actually aired it out quite a bit because of Gardner Minshew ending up taking over after the injury to Anthony Richardson. And we're not going to see this be a team that's going to throw the ball quite as much as what they did last season. On top of that, the passing volume in general could just be less efficient. I know Anthony Richardson's a much more athletic quarterback, someone who's probably going to be better on the field, but as a pure passer, I think it's fair to say that the jury's still out in terms of whether or not he can be a better passer of the football than Gardner Minshew. And on top of that, there's going to be increased competition for targets in this Colts offense as well. They drafted A.D. Mitchell in the second round. Joshua Downs is in his second year, so we expect him to be better. Jelani Woods is going to come back from injury. And on top of that, Jonathan Taylor is going to play a full season here, early start the season healthy and on the roster. So it's just a lot of competition for targets here. We know when they get it in close, it's going to be Jonathan Taylor and Anthony Richardson looking to run the ball in. So we're going to see pretty limited pass catching opportunities for Pittman near the goal line. So I don't see this either as being a lot of touchdown upside. He's a guy that kind of gets used pretty close to the line of scrimmage. So he's not someone that I'd expect to see put up a huge 18-yard per catch number and just sort of volley or efficiency his way into a top 12 finish. So even though he's probably going to be okay, I don't think he can finish inside the top 10, and he can certainly finish outside the top 25. So taking him as the wide receiver 12 is just way too high for me. Great player, but just not someone that I really find myself drafting this season. Next up, we've got an obvious one, at least in my opinion, and that's going to be Stefon Diggs, who I just don't see being a player that finishes even remotely close to where he's being drafted right now. He's coming off of an awful second half of the last season where the Bills were effectively willing to give him up for absolutely nothing. They got a fifth-round pick for Stefon Diggs, and they actually took on a larger cap hit this season to get rid of him. So there was no cap benefit to the Buffalo Bills getting rid of him. They clearly didn't think he was contributing to their offense, and it's just on top of that extremely rare for three wide receivers from the same team to finish in the top 24. It's happened 2 times in the last 15 years. You can think of the Carolina Panthers, which is sort of an outlier when they had Robbie Anderson, DJ Moore, and Curtis Samuel do it. With the Bridgewater, which is extremely fluky. And then you got to go back to Peyton Manning with Eric Decker, Wes Welker, and Demaryius Thomas. It's just not something that really happens. You need a pretty historic offense for that to happen. That Panthers example sort of happened because Curtis Samuel was a hybrid running back for them after Christian McCaffrey went down. So you don't really see it being a situation that happens all that often. And the fact of the matter is you're going to need that to happen for Diggs to even finish remotely near his ADP. He's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 18. I am projecting him to finish third on the team in targets and just overall fantasy production. He sets out as my wide receiver 41 right now, which is by no means useless. I think he's still going to be a solid low-end wide receiver 3 flex guy, a guy that can be played on a week-to-week basis, but not a guy that's going to finish as a wide receiver 2 or have wide receiver 1 upside this season. And the issue is he just costs you a third-round draft pick right now. On some platforms, he's going in the second round, and there's just no world where that he really pays off that ADP. They just gave Nico Collins a huge extension. Houston clearly believes Collins is their number one. CJ Stroud and Tank Dell are good friends. They've got a ton of chemistry. Tank Dell is going to be hyper involved in this offense, and I think I'm assuming the positive side here when I'm saying Stefon Diggs finishes as the wide receiver 41, because that's me assuming he's still good and involved in the offense, but he was really bad last season, and the Texans have no commitment to him beyond the season. Like I said, they traded a fifth-round pick for him. They are by no means committed to him at all, and Noah Brown put up some really big games for this team last season. They have decent players behind Stefon Diggs. If Stefon Diggs is just completely worthless, you've got Dalton Schultz, you've got Joe Mixon, you've got Collins, you've got Tank Dell. They don't need Stefon Diggs to be involved in this offense. So if Diggs comes out and he's just completely washed, we could see Diggs being effectively a non-factor and being a guy that we're even looking at in fantasy, and that legitimately is in the range of outcomes, even if CJ Stroud puts up some monster numbers like we're expecting. So the floor is literally 0 for Stefon Diggs this season, and I think the ceiling is probably right around where he's being drafted as a low-end wide receiver 2, and I don't see there being any world where he breaks that ADP, and he's just not someone that I'm targeting at all. He's got a lot of name value attached to him. That's why he's being drafted so high. People are super excited about the Texans in this offense, and I am too, but you need this to be a historic, record-breaking offense for all three of these wide receivers to return value, and Stefon Diggs is being drafted way too high for me to be comfortable with that. And the last player I'll talk about here is going to be the only tight end on the list, and that's going to be Sam Laporta. And I know I've kind of talked bad about Sam Laporta a little bit this offseason. I don't want to sound like a Sam Laporta hater. I do think Sam Laporta is legitimately a talented player. He's going to finish as probably a top 5 tight end again this season. But the issue for me is just the ADP. He's currently being drafted in the 3rd round, and I'll get to tier lists. Actually, it's going to be the next set of videos I start going over, and that's going to sort of help explain why I don't see this working out for me. And the issue is just that I think there's a really large tier 1 for the tight end position this season. There are a lot of guys that could all legitimately finish as the tight end 1 this year. You've obviously got Laporta, who did it last year. You've got Kelsey and Mark Andrews, who have done it several times in the past. Trey McBride's a guy that I personally think has as good of a shot as anybody to do it. And then on top of that, you could sprinkle in guys like Evan Ingram, Dalton Kincaid, David Njoku. Ingram and Kincaid were both top 3 tight ends over the back half of last season, or Ingram and Njoku. Kincaid's a guy that could easily be the wide receiver 1 in Buffalo this season. We could see him slide up into that tier as well. So what I'm saying here is there are 7 names I'm showing here that I think have at least a legitimate shot at finishing at the tight end 1 in fantasy this season. And when that's the case, being the team that drafts the first one likely means you're getting the worst value. So even though Sam Laporta could legitimately be a high-end producer again, probably going to be a top 5, even maybe a top 3 tight end this season, the issue is that you're drafting him at a round 3 price tag, and you can get the same tier of players 2 or 3 rounds later, and guys like Trey McBride, Mark Andrews, the guys I'm talking about that I think have a legitimate shot to finish above him. So I just don't find myself drafting Sam Laporta. I think he's, like I said, going to finish as a fringe top 5 tight end again this season. Good player, but I just don't see the 10 touchdowns happening again, and I think there's a lot of really good values outside of him at the tight end position this season. So it's just something I'm avoiding. I have no problem if you want to take him, but I just think of these tight ends I'm talking about, he's the worst value available to us right now. So that'll do it for this bust video. I'll probably do one more as we get closer to like the end of July, early August, see if I can talk about some other names, talk about some guys that I'm not necessarily drafting. Up next, we're going to get into some tier lists. So I'll go over my quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end tier lists. I find tier lists to be extremely valuable in drafting just because you generally don't want to be the player to take the first player at a positional tier. You want to be the player that's getting the last one on the board because that means you're getting the best value at them. You're getting the same tier of player later in the draft, which means there's a greater value. Obviously, these like linear rankings going straight 1 through 100, they're fun, they're good to look at, but if you don't break it into tiers, you're not going to see where these cliffs are and understand how it helps you draft the best position and understand what position you guys should be drafting in each of your picks. So a lot of fun doing those. It's also fun just to sort of see where we have things stacked up. So it's going to be a lot of fun. There's going to be a lot more videos coming out for the next several weeks and several months. We're going to get into 3 to 4 videos a week over the course of the rest of the off season. We'll get into even more of that as we get into the regular season, and it's just going to be a lot of fun. We're super close to my goal of 1,000 subscribers. As I'm recording this right now, we were at 998 last time I checked. So if you and a buddy want to subscribe right now, you can be the 999th and 1,000th subscriber to the channel. So that'd be super cool. It's been a goal of mine for a long time. So if you're not subscribed already, just hit that button. It'll do me a favor. It'll help me help you, and just be fun to have you as a part of the community as well. So it's going to be a lot of fun, a lot more to come, and I'm super excited for it. So thanks for everybody. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Peace. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.